This is week 2 on Roadblocks to Republic, and this has to do with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Yeah, we did this stuff too, going back to 1798, and also actually included here from 1918, the Sedition Act in the First World War. So the Sedition Act from 1918 is included in this handout, which the other one here, I mean, the what comes out of the 5th Congress, I mean, you would have been here reading a week. Beg your pardon? Is it too loud? Is it? Not for me. Not for. Okay. Well, I'll cut it back a little bit. But what I have here is on the from the 5th Congress is about aliens and so on and so forth here, because keep in mind there was a backlash against imports even in 1794, 1796, 1798. And then when you look at some of the people who came here, like Thomas Cooper, the well-known editor, who's going to be caught up in the Sedition Act. He'll wind up with 6 months in jail and fined $400. Ouch, that's a lot of money then. And he was a British import. Other editors, one from Ireland, Albert Gallatin, who was part of the United States government, came from Geneva. And so, again, this frowning on immigrants, it's what works for certain people at the time. But of course, to get into this difference, the Alien and Sedition Act gets you to the differences in your politics here. And I'm talking Jefferson and Hamilton. And you're talking here the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalists, which is something George Washington was not a fan of. George Washington did not believe in political parties. He said they create factionalism. She says, no kidding. But I mean, keep in mind the state of the country here when he's president. In 1789 here, these parties are developing. The factions are developing. Let's put it this way: the factions are developing, but there will be no political conventions. There's going to be no campaigning of sorts. How can you have it? There's no television, obviously, here. So how can you have these big political conventions and campaigning? It's almost like instead of the man seeking the office seeks the man. Because George Washington wanted to go home. He had done a lot, by the way, leading the Continental Army, putting down a potential, I brought that up last week, the mutinies in the armies. He put that down and hung around for the Constitutional Convention. But who else really, if you think about it, who else really could become our first president? People saw him as the great unifier, especially from the perspective that he didn't make a grab for the seat. He didn't take over the country, which does not put him in the same class as a Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, people like this. He didn't do that. However, at the same time here, two of his major advisors here are Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, who really, as far as theory goes, as far as political ideas go, they were his superior. But at the same time, perhaps Mr. Washington was a bit wiser here. And you begin to see, and one of the reasons he's going to hang around for a second term is to referee what's going on between Hamilton and Jefferson. And that speaks volumes of the man himself. I mean, he wants to go home. He's already served a term as president. He wants to go home. He's not. He'll hang around. Of course, after 1796, I'm out of here. And he begins, if you want to use that term, he begins this idea of the two-term presidency. It's not even a law yet, but he begins this. The example here? Yeah. But keep in mind what's happening in the country too. This is truly not a together country at this stage. And you can see here, you can see here that Jeffersonian idea that the agrarian is the salt of the earth. And Jefferson's idea of the agrarian as the salt of the earth is that he writes this: if ever there is a chosen people in this world, it's the farmer. The farmer takes care of the land. The farmer is an individual. And it's the farmer that will protect representative government, because that farmer is an individual, as opposed to people who live in cities. And that's the last thing he wanted to see here: vast urbanization. He thought people living on top of each other in a city are poor caretakers of representative government. And they do not respect the idea, or there is a lack of respect for the idea of owning property to maintain a functioning system of representative government. He believed that. But however, what's going on at this stage? The Industrial Revolution, and what's going to happen to those ideas? Yeah, interesting here. As opposed to Mr. Hamilton, oh yeah, Mr. Jefferson had no use for Mr. Hamilton's idea of the rich and the well-born. He didn't have any use for that at all. And yet Mr. Hamilton is of a different ilk. He wants to industrialize the country. He wants the growth of finance in this country. He thinks that's what's going to protect the revolution and our government in the end. And you can see this trend here. Where's England going? They're well into the Industrial Revolution at this point. And so Jefferson lambastes Hamilton for being too much of an admirer of England. Financialization, industrialization. What did we fight the revolution for? We threw the revolution to throw them out of here. And now you have a guy like Hamilton who caters to that agenda. And yet again, if you look down the road here, what is Joe Stalin going to do? Yeah, the same thing. This idea of the proletarian revolution, and then working with the peasantry. No, we're going to organize society, and he industrializes the Soviet Union. And so these two camps, after the Constitutional Convention, begin to emerge here, and they will form parties, factionalism, even to the point where you see this today with some of your Democrats and Republicans. Do they like even sitting in the same room with each other? Yeah, idiots, she says. And yet at the same time, you will see that after George Washington leaves office, between Federalists / Democrat Republicans. And yet in the end here, you will see it's really not Jefferson who's the real political theorist. It's Madison. Madison knew how to play the political game here. He's lurking in the background. And he's one of the authors of The Federalist, just like Alexander Hamilton was. But as America is beginning to form here, 1787 is the end of the Constitutional Convention. France, 1789, the French Revolution. And this helps to accentuate these camps. And George Washington again comes to mind here. We don't want associations or accords or treaties with nations that are going to undermine our Constitution. We don't want that, especially military alliances, because that obligates us to answer that alliance if whoever we're allied with goes to war. Well, what happened here in 1778 to get the French on board with us during our revolution here, to get their help? We were obligated to help them protect their colonies in the Caribbean. And that didn't go over well with the Hamilton camp, being more pro-British. And when this revolution starts, 1789, Jefferson and his crowd are pro-radical. They're pro-radical. In fact, where is Jefferson? Wasn't he our ambassador to France at one point here? And he was talked to by French radicals almost he was out the front door. He's descended on by some of these French radicals. Gee whiz, what did you folks do? Can we do the same thing? It's almost like he's a teacher here. But then again, unlike our revolution, what happens to the French? It really descends into unbridled violence. Even to the extent that even though, Jefferson comes home and is one of the primary advisors to President Washington, just like Alexander Hamilton is, by 1792, 1793, Edmund Guéné comes to this country. He's an ambassador. He's sent as an ambassador by the French Revolutionary government. He is here to try to get us more involved in this. And they're already fighting with the British again. 1792, the French Revolutionary Wars, where these monarchs want to kill these. It's enough. We have this, as the British used to call us, this grimy thumbprint of a republic over here in what's called the United States. We don't need the idea of a republic growing in the belly of the beast where the monarchs are. And so they're going to try to kill this in the womb. Well, what are the French going to do? They're going to come knocking on our front door. We helped you, you help us. And Guéné is traveling around this country. He comes into Charleston, South Carolina. And he's asking for help. And he's going around the White House to do this, trying to sign up American ship owners as privateers to attack British shipping, trying to get Americans to sign up as soldiers and even get commissions in the French Army and French Navy. And George Washington's not a big fan of this. And when he has Guéné at the White House, at the Capitol, to discuss what he's doing, he tells him in no uncertain terms. Of course, Washington's a pretty polite individual. It's not like he's talking to George Patton. And he frowns on this. But Mr. Guéné, who sees basic American support for the French since they're throwing out a monarch. That's what Americans did. And he's going to play on this. Come to find out, it's interesting here how Washington is not a vindictive individual. The political winds have changed in France while Guéné is here, and it moves more to the left. He's considered part of the right. And a new French representative will come here and is supposed to apprehend Guéné and bring him home. Well, what do you think Guéné thinks? The guillotine is waiting for me? The terror. And he petitions for asylum, political asylum. And Washington, not being a vindictive man, agrees to this. And later, Guéné will marry a daughter of an American judge, and they'll wind up farming in Long Island. But they send another man here by the name of Maine of Audet, and he's another one trying to get France involved in the war. Now, two camps begin to emerge here. Again, something Washington was not a fan of, where Americans get involved in other countries' issues, problems. And it extends here politically. The Hamiltonians supporting the British or being pro-British are appalled, absolutely appalled by the excesses of what's going on in France, as opposed to many Americans who support the change in government in France are not really too enthusiastic about condemning the excesses going on in France, although Jefferson later will. He later will. And so this helps to accentuate politics here at home, creating what? Factions. where the Hamiltonians are thinking, well, those Democrat Republicans, they're radicals. You don't want them in office, they're radicals. As opposed to that, to the Jeffersonians or the Democrat Republicans, you know, who they begin to call, by the way, monocrats. They're pro-monarch. We threw a monarch out of here. Why would you want these people in power for? And yet, the poster child expressions of these two ideologies are advising the president. And Washington, in essence, is becoming a referee. Interesting here. The Jay Treaty of 1794, 1795, it's ratified. The idea here is where the British want us involved in this war, and they eat to the point where they'll have the United States be now an opponent of the French. They understand that the United States still has that alliance of 1778, where if Britain invades French possessions in the Caribbean, we are obligated to help the French, something Washington is adamantly against. Again, he feels these ideas of associations with foreign powers, especially of a military variety, undermines the Constitution, our blueprint for government. You know, where Congress declares war, how many Americans, yeah, it's nice to be friends with the French. It's nice to support the French Revolution. How many Americans are going to want to go to a possession in the Caribbean run by the French because the British had invaded? How many Americans are going to want to do that? Especially when Washington understands here, Washington understands that at this point, how many men in the American Army? 2,635? How many ships in the Navy? 2 or 3? What kind of a military force is that? Is it going to help us to get involved in a war to help the French? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so the Jay Treaty is to make peace with the British so we don't get involved in this war. And because there's another problem here, too, that Washington understands very well. Even after the American Revolution, the British hadn't gotten out of the Ohio Territory. They hadn't gotten out. The Indians, we still have an Indian problem. We are fighting the Indians, and getting into 1790, 1792, American troops aren't doing all that great against the Indians. Why? The British are helping the Indians. They're supporting the Indians. They're really not involved in the fighting, but they're supporting the Indians. Maybe with the Jay Treaty, we can eliminate that. Not a bad idea. And John Jay will go to England to try to negotiate a treaty. Again, one of the co-authors of what's later going to be known as the Federalist Papers. He did write a number of studies for the that's going to be collated in this book called The Federalist. He will get the British to stop building forts in that territory and eventually close down and get out. He will eventually get them to stop supporting the Indians. That they will do. And the British, being the nice people that they are, say that they will open up Asian ports to American shippers. That's nice of them. But again, and they even say they will repay the shippers in this country for the ships that they've snatched. Keep in mind, both the British and the French are snatching American ships during this great French War. We're trading with both. Do you think the French want us trading with the British? No. They're going to snatch our ships. Do you think the British want us trading with the French? No. Anywhere between 1792 and maybe 1794, 95, 600 American ships are snatched. 600. 600. And the British said, okay, we'll allow you to trade with our colonies in the Mediterranean. I mean, in the Caribbean. But they add so many restrictions and so many impediments, the Americans give up and say, that's enough, we're not doing that. And the British also state, sure, we're gonna reimburse the shippers for the ships we've taken and the cargoes taken, but that's not going to stop us from taking more ships if you're gonna continue to trade with the French. And since the British have a larger navy than the French, guess who's going to be taking more ships? The British. However, having said that, when the Jay Treaty is ratified, it's thought at this point, great, we're not going to get involved in this war. We're not going to send troops to France. We are not, and we're not going to send troops to French Caribbean, to French colonies in the Caribbean to help the French. We're not going to do that. And we're making sure at this point that British troops are out of that Ohio territory. And it seems that we're overcoming the Indian problem here. And they are, because the Indians will pull out of that territory. And once they pull out, what do you think happens? Massive white Americans go rushing into this territory. Guess who else sees this? The Spanish. Uh-oh. And we will make a deal the following year, 1795, 1796, which will allow us to have a free use of the free use of the Mississippi River, and also to export goods out of New Orleans. And we will make a new deal with the Spanish, changing the border of Florida. We get some more territory, and the Mississippi Territory is created here. And so it seems like the deal, beginning with the Jay Treaty, works. But then again, at the end of the Washington's second term, his farewell address, he warns again about factionalism and parties, over-bloated militaries. He warns against this. And yet, it seems that farewell address, and it's worth reading that farewell address. It really is worth reading, because when you read about what he says about over-bloated militaries, then fast forward to Eisenhower in '61 about the military-industrial complex. 1796 here, folks, is tied to 1961 in this respect. And keep in mind, they have something in common. They were both generals, Washington and Eisenhower. If anybody knew the score here, you would think they would. But instead of this being a manifesto of where the country should go, it's almost like the opening gun. Because now the positions are solidified. The Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. Interesting where this goes. There are some Federalists who wanted Thomas Pinckney to be the primary for the White House. Alexander Hamilton wanted that because Thomas Pinckney can be directed here. Not so John Adams, who at times can be caustic, who at times, not at times, this was a man who had command of his own mind, so to speak, by comparison. And he's actually going to win that nomination. He's actually going to win the White House. But then again, he has 71 electoral votes as opposed to the loser. Back then, whoever finished second with the electoral votes became vice president. And it wasn't Thomas Pinckney, who was also a Federalist. He finished third. Guess who finishes second? Thomas Jefferson. So now you have a Federalist as president and a Democrat Republican as vice president, and they're going to cure that issue after the 1800 election, where you'll be voting for, now it's like it is now, you vote for slates, you vote for president and vice president on the same slate. You didn't have that then. Again, this growth of the party structure. And this, to me, is a problem with your Constitution. But again, there weren't parties when they drew up the Constitution. In your Constitution, they tell you, you can vote for your president, but aren't there checks on you? They're called electors, right? Yeah, they are. They're called electors. Your representatives are in 2 years. Your senators, in the beginning of this country, your senators, you didn't vote for them. They were appointed by your state legislators, who you vote for. That's like throwing, catering to states' rights here. But then again, are there mechanisms in your Constitution as to who or how elected officials are really generated? No. No. And so political parties come along and fill that void. So who controls today bringing up representatives and senators and presidential contestants for the offices? Democrats and Republicans, right? Maybe something like that should have been written into the Constitution at the beginning. That's a void. It's been filled by Democrats and Republicans. And that doesn't make some people happy today. Now, maybe again, going back to what Jefferson said in 1816 in that letter to Samuel Kercheval, the Constitution should be updated every 19 or 20 years. In other words, a constitutional convention. Each generation should acclimate the document to that generation. He understood that the country in 1787 was not going to be the same country in 1837. He understood that. But that doesn't happen, so you get Democrat Republicans versus Federalists. But now you have a Federalist president with a Democrat Republican vice president. And this isn't such a bad thing here because Adams and Jefferson do not hate each other. And they have something in common. Neither like Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is looking to control the Federalist Party. Even to the point where he is looking, by the way, to extend America into what you're going to call the Louisiana Purchase. Even extending us even south to the point where he says, eventually I would like America to frown on South America. You have to, literally with your eyes, frown. That means you got to be on the border. That's what he's looking to do here. That's what he's looking to do. And yet at the same time, you're into 1797, 1798, 1799 at this point. France is still trying to get us involved in the revolution. And what starts here, the French also attacking American shipping, like in the Caribbean, this starts something known as the Quasi-War. And there are some who want, a declaration of war. Adams does not. Adams does not want us to get into a war here. Again, he's willing to support an increase in money being sent to the American military. He wants to enlarge the Army. Also to appropriate enough money to build 40 warships. But at this point, 1797, 1798, at this point, the Army's around 3,500. The armed forces are about 3,500 men with 3 warships. How's that going to work? And so we begin to enlist the privateers here. In other words, merchant ships throwing guns on them, and they'll prey on French shipping. In fact, one ship will be built up in the upstate Connecticut here. This ship will be the second warship named Connecticut, and she will be sent to the Caribbean to prey on French pirate ships and privateers. And she will be down there 1799 to almost 1800. And she will actually do a pretty, in fact, she's renowned in this area for her speed. And she will pull off a coup by actually ending the career of the Italia Conquiste, which was a well-known French privateer / pirate ship in the Caribbean that had it had sunk or captured 155 American vessels. And the Connecticut put an end to that career. Interesting little side note here about this warship named Connecticut. Interesting little side note. She went back to New London, where she was supposed to be refurbished and sent to the Pacific, but the quasi-war had ended by then, so she was she was mustered out of the Navy after that, 1801. And so this begins something known as the XYZ affair. And so Adams is going to send several representatives to talk to the French about ending the so-called quasi-war. Charles Pinckney is one of them, Thomas Pinckney's older brother, John Marshall from Virginia, and Eldridge Geary from Massachusetts, who was a friend of Jefferson's. And Talleyrand from France wants, if we're going to have any solution to Franco-American issues here, he wants a bribe. That's what he wants. Why? Because he lost a lot of money during the French Revolution. Oh well. And Adams won't countenance this. And so this does accentuate that difference at home between Federalist and Democrat Republicans, because there are still Democrat Republicans still supporting the French Revolution here, and Federalists who are not. The British represent order. You know, the British represent reining in radicalism. But again, Democrat Republicans like Jefferson do not. And so when Adams rebuffs Talleyrand, and this news comes out that the French want a bribe, and there are many Americans now on their high horse. They don't like that. They turn against the French. But then again, in new discussions between the United States and France, Talleyrand takes the bribes off the table. And that treaty we had in 1778 with the French obligating us to defend French colonies in the Caribbean is over. And so the chance of us getting involved in the Great French War in Europe is over and done here. And so the war scare will be over. However, having said that, you know, Thomas Jefferson is coming on here for the 1800 election, which is going to be coming up. He's becoming very popular here in the face of the Federalists, who are now beginning to crack here and panic. They're beginning to crack and panic. You know, they want to keep control. They believe in strong central government, as opposed to the Jeffersonian types who don't. And yet, this idea of strong central government smacks of what? Britain. We threw the British out of here. And so since some are thinking, you know, like people like Hamilton are thinking, we may not win the next election, we need to keep Democrat Republican editors in line. And so the Alien and Sedition Acts will be passed. Now, part of the Alien end of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the naturalization of Americans. You know, back then you had to be here 5 years before you could had any chance of becoming a citizen. The Federalists have this changed to 14 years. You have to be here 14 years before you become a citizen. Alien, if you are working against the United States, you could be subject to deportation or jailing or worse. But it has to be during a declared war. That's part of the legislation. The quasi-war was not a declared war. And there was not one case where John Adams used that against people who were could be considered alien. He didn't use it at all. the Sedition Act, writing anything or saying anything in public against elected officials in government. Thomas Cooper, an editor who was lambasting the Federalists. You know, there's going to be about 25 people brought up for prosecution. 10 will go to jail because they were speaking or saying their mind. And here you see Thomas Cooper is one. He was actually a British radical who came here. He could have been subject to the Alien Act. He's an immigrant. Here we go with that word again, immigrants, immigration, right? He will be sentenced for 6 to 6 months and fined $400 in jail. Charles Holt is another editor. He will be prosecuted and sentenced to 3 months and have to pay a fine of $200. James Collender will be sentenced to 4 months in jail and have to pay a $200 fine. Thomas Cooper is interesting. When he gets out of jail, he's on his high horse. He wants Alexander Hamilton prosecuted for this witch hunt against these journalists. And guess where that's going to go? And so the idea of free speech and freedom of expression, which Jefferson says this is against the First Amendment. That's what Jefferson says. And yet, when you take a look at this, fast forward to May 16, 1918, on that third page of that handout, U.S. Sedition Act. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with the intent to interfere with the operation or success of military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote success of its enemies, or shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements, or incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military and naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting, enlistment, so on and so forth, shall willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of the United States government, you can be arrested or punished by a fine of no more. You can be a fine of no more than $10,000 or imprisonment for not more than 20 years. And so, interesting here, you will see Upton Sinclair. Remember him? He wrote the book The Jungle, right, exposing the meatpacking industry. That book was very impactful. He'll get arrested for reading the Bill of Rights in public. Your Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights. Eugene Debs will get arrested for reading the Constitution in public. Of course, he was well, yeah, it does make sense to a certain extent. You're looking to have everyone on the same page here in an industrialized war. And so, and still he's running, interesting, he's in jail, he's still running for president, he gets 1 million votes. He was a socialist. Let me ask you a question. Did Jill Stein get 1 million votes in November 2016? She got slightly under 500,000. Guy's in jail. Of course, he's got people campaigning for him like Helen Keller. That's interesting. I'm getting ready to, I found it and I'm going to publish, I'm going to print it out, the FBI file on Helen Keller. It's about 48 pages. FBI file on Helen Keller. Because she was a socialist. She was a socialist. Vehemently anti-Woodrow Wilson, vehemently anti-war, pro-peace, pro-worker, anti-capitalist. And she'll support, mind you, she'll support Lenin's revolution in 1917. Now, could that have been enough to have Helen Keller arrested? Is that a judgment call here? Look at what you see today about whistleblowers. Whistleblowers aren't spies. Whistleblowers are people who bring up the deficiencies in your government that perhaps Congress should be addressing. And yet under Mr. Obama, he prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other president in American history. So much for him being a Democrat. And so, well, Woodrow Wilson was what? A Democrat. And so take a look at the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. Take a look at 1918, and take a look at what's going on now with some of these so-called whistleblowers. So we do have a track record here on frowning on freedom of expression. It's fascinating here. It truly is. It truly is. Absolutely fascinating. Wow. And so is that a roadblock to a functioning republic? Yes. Yes, it is. Now, I know myself. I wrote a thing the other, well, it was a little while back on what was going, my opinion on what was going on down on the south of the border here, separating children from their families, that kind of thing. And I titled the article, "The True Nature of American Fascism." And I'll tell you, there were some Republicans, when I went to the American Legion the following week, I got the cold shoulder. And some of them are your elected officials here. Not necessarily in Darien, but in the area. And I told one in particular, gee, that's tough. Deal with it. It's free speech. I said that's what some of these veterans fought for. So, somebody had a hand up, I thought. Yes. Yeah, it's called The True Nature of American Fascism. And it was published in it was published in the Hour. The longer version of it is RSN News. They published the full length. The Hour has a 700-word cap. If you want, I'll bring copies in next week if you want. And I offered here how what we're doing here really isn't much difference than what the Southern slaveholders were doing as slave. And I'm going to get into that when I do American Gulag in January. How as we're expanding as a country, right? And take cotton for instance. Cotton needs 200 frostless days, according to my research anyway. And so you're growing cotton in North Carolina, then you're growing it in South Carolina, then you're going to be growing it in Georgia, so on and so forth. Then you're going to go west, like Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Now, you don't have to worry too much about frost here. However, having said that, that means if you're expanding the slavocracy, there's more plantations. Where are they going to get the bodies from to pick this stuff? From the present plantations. They're going to be selling, and how are they doing this? They're taking children away from black families and just selling them to the new plantations. Harriet Tubman's family, they had 9 kids in that family. Well, guess what's going to happen to 3 of them? Sold. And the parents can't do a thing about it. And so you're taking children away from their parents. How do you think they're going to grow up as people? And guess who else was doing this in Europe? And that's the way I wrote it in that commentary I wrote about the Papal States kidnapping Jewish children from Jewish families and forcibly raising them as Christian. And the way I put it, I said Papal goon squads. And that didn't go over well with a couple of people I know. That's just tough. That's the way it is. That's what they were. And so, and that's not just pick on Catholics. The Ottomans here, too, were doing the same sort of thing in the 19th century, trying to get people, forcing Jewish people and Christians to become Muslims to increase Ottomanism. I mean, they're all doing this, but that was the comparison I was making. Yes. And then well, yeah, I mean, that was an agenda. And so when you get back to the Alien and Sedition Act, and some people, when you want to, you know, how many people really write about that? You know, you get into, I mean, we're moving off the Alien and Sedition Act, but when you go to somebody like a Josiah Strong, who was a cleric, who wrote a book called Our Country, 1885, I think it was. That's on my hit list of books I got to get. But he wrote in this book, I've read extracts of it, that we are the chosen people, and this is a cleric, and he says we're going to, you know, the white man's burden, remember that one, mission, civilistries, and so on and so forth. And the idea is to get into South America, the islands, and even move to Africa to bring, you know, civilization and the true religion to these people. This guy's a cleric. Now let's understand this. It's to take the resources. You know, because 5 years later, what comes out? The book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mann. And militarily speaking, legitimately, if you have a large navy, an opposing navy can't get to your shore, that's fine. But he's also alluding to the fact that, you know, a navy assures you of overseas markets. Yeah. So put that together with Josiah Strong here. Yes. Well, you can even go back to bouncing off what you're saying here, the slave issue, how slaves got here. I mean, how do you think some of these white slave traders got the blacks they're bringing? Because some of the other tribes, this is our way of getting rid of the competition. That's not discussed too often. I was being polite, but I'll go with what. Yeah, what's the word I'm looking for? The probation period, if you want to use that term. It was 5 years, but the Federalists changed it to 14. And people thought, some of these people who came here, because keep in mind with the French Revolution, you had some French coming here to get away from that mess. And that didn't set well with Federalists. Could apply for citizenship. Right. Now they changed the 14. You know, that's something I would have to look into, because I'm not, number one, I'm not a lawyer, but at the same time here, yeah. But then again, when you look at what, I'm not going to land-based FDR, but during World War II, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, what happened? They rounded up American citizens, which is what Eleanor Roosevelt's going to tell her husband. You are rounding up American citizens. How the heck can you do this? And so about 110, 120,000 of them are going to be rounded up, and they're going to lose their homes. They're going to be put into these camps. And yet later on, not in the not too distant future, for many of these Japanese families, where are their sons going? Into the army and fight for the United States and Italy. And so, but then again, not you know, how you want to approach this. How many here have ever heard of Plan de San Diego? Plan de San Diego. It has nothing to do with San Diego, California. The Mexican Revolution started in 1910. In January 1915, some Mexicans were planning this thing known as there's a little town, I think it's in Texas, called San Diego. Has nothing to do with California. And this idea here was to raise up. Keep in mind, you're in the throes of the Mexican Revolution. And so the idea here was to raise up Mexicans along the Mexican side of the border, Mexican Americans on our side of the border, and raise up blacks, Indians, Yaquis, and Apaches. I believe it was Apaches, or in Japanese Americans, anyone who had felt the sting of white racism, to raise these people up and get Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and part of Colorado back. And it would be an independent republic. Get this, an independent republic. And all white males above 16 years of age would be exterminated. And all white women and their kids pushed out. And then within a few years, they would apply to Mexico to be absorbed into Mexico. Now, most Mexicans on the border didn't go with this. Most practically all Mexican Americans, this is a pipe dream. Indians, they don't get a big following here, but it existed. You can go to the Texas Historical Society online and read some of this. It's fascinating what you read here. Yet, it does start a guerrilla war on that Texas border. And Texas Rangers are going to be deputizing farmers here. Do you think anyone's controlling these farmers? And so, these ranchers? No. And so, upwards of 300 people will get killed here in this guerrilla war. And most of them will be Mexican Americans. And many of them are going to lose their land to who? The ranchers. There's your license to take the land. And so, of course, in March of 1916, Pancho Villa would make that raid. And then we are going to go, and then President Wilson's going to send Blackjack Pershing and 5,000 American troops into Mexico. You know where that goes. And they will never get Pancho Villa. But the fact of the matter is, you had this, but supposedly, the Japanese sent arms experts to help these revolutionaries. Now, this incident is absolutely forgotten today. But maybe in 1941 by some Americans, it was not. And I'm not asking you to fall in line with what Roosevelt did. I'm not asking you to do that at all. But by adding this little wrinkle, I'm trying to give you a better understanding as to why why the rationale for this. Well, if they tried something on this small scale in 1915, look what they did at Pearl Harbor. Round them up. That's almost a Stalinist approach, because it's interesting here, the two big winners of this war, the United States and the Soviet Union, what the hell do you think Stalin was doing with some of these nationalities? Like the Crimean Tatars. He rounded up 100,000 of them from Crimea, put them on the boxcars, and of course, Mr. Stalin isn't as gentle about this as FDR, throws them on the boxcars, takes them to Irkutsk, the doors are open and they're dumped, train leaves. The train leaves. And so, do you honestly think the people in Irkutsk, how many Americans know where Irkutsk is? Yeah, interesting, Irkutsk, what the heck is that? Sounds like a disease. Yeah, it was to a certain extent. Do you honestly think those people want those Crimean Tatars? No. And yet at the same time, they're the sons of some of these Crimean Tatars are in the front in the Red Army fighting the Nazi invaders. Wow, of course, Stalin did this compared to us on steroids. He moved more than just the Crimean Tatars. But it's interesting here what you say. But yeah, there's a project for you. Plan de San Diego. Look this up. Interesting what you find here. And one of the planners was captured. I forgot his name. The last name began with a B. It's been a while since I looked. In fact, I just found out about this about 8 years ago. I'm thinking, where the heck have I been? Then I find out most other people, no, they don't know about this. Interesting, one of these little out-of-the-way topics here, American history. But again, inflaming people on the border to throw us out. It wasn't going to happen. I mean, that's a pipe dream. But the plan itself existed, and it spurs something else, a little guerrilla war on the border. So, wow. But again, getting back to the topic here, yeah, there have been instances in this country where you've had censorship, outright squelching of public opinion. And of course, when you go back, and it's interesting too, because here you see the Federalists trying to take control of opinion, and yet Wilson's going to do that in the First World War. Of course, now you're in a declared war, and does that give the president the right to do that? There's a discussion for you. Yes. You know, several years ago, 5 years ago, a college down in Georgia was going to republish Mark Twain's books, and they were going to sanitize Huckleberry Finn by taking the word nigger out of it. And to me, that's a window into that time. You might not like the use of the word in that book, but it's a window into America as it was, at least in a literary fashion. And I wrote to that university. I said, are you kidding me? You got to be kidding. And so I wrote an op-ed on that for the Hour. And I used the word nigger 3 times. And when I went down with Andre down to the Hour for LLI, I saw Gerald Ferraro, the editor, one of the editors at the time. He goes to me, he goes, come here. And he says, we read that op-ed of yours. I said, yes. He said, that was the first topic on the Monday morning meeting. He said, the discussion lasted 5 minutes. And he said, myself, and 2 other editors overrode the objections. And they printed it without editing it. And Gerald Ferraro told me, he goes, that's freedom of expression. That's journal. He says he said it was journalism. I was just using it as a protest, really. And they published it. Interesting. They didn't edit it. They didn't edit 1 word. And you know what? I had a few black people tell me, now what's wrong with that? Nope. Didn't get anything. That I don't know. But I didn't see anything days afterwards condemning me for using that language. But some black people, what's wrong with that? Sometimes, yeah. But I mean, the idea of editors like this going along with this, this is freedom of expression, it's journalism, it's the right, it's freedom of expression, that kind of, as outlined in the First Amendment. You can't censor that. The Supreme Court to back up Daniel Ellsberg, and he took a big chance doing that. And so, yeah, and then now there's the issue of Edward Snowden. That's an interesting issue here. And yet Ellsberg supports Snowden 100%. And so, of course, times are different. Snowden got out of the country. Ellsberg didn't. And so part of that is my belief, part of that, not all of it, but part of it is, back when Ellsberg did that, you had a functioning left. Here you don't anymore, to that extent. And so that's part of this too. But is Snowden really an enemy spy? No, he was a whistleblower. But then again, look who your president was. Well, Ted Kennedy's dead, McGovern's dead, Frank Church is dead, Feingold was purged, and Kucinich was gerrymandered out. That's just the start. I mean, people like Schumer and Pelosi and Reid, the Obamas, the Clintons, you really think they're liberal? They're corporate Democrats, they're not liberals. Well, keep in mind, going back to Daniel Ellsberg, and this is another important point too, go back to that era when you had 40 or 50 owners of media. And if you owned a TV station or radio, maybe you couldn't own a newspaper magazine in that area. Or if you owned a newspaper magazine, whatever, you couldn't own a TV station or a radio station. There was a plethora of opinions here. You have 6 owners of media now. And Google, and Facebook, so on and so forth. And so this consolidation of media, I mean, you don't have. I mean, and this goes back to parties too. Having been an ex-Republican, I used to pine for watching Firing Line with William F. Buckley, because I used to like the banter that went on between him and his guests, and he put forth that conservative agenda with a Churchillian verve. I thought was not only politically stimulating, intellectually it was. Boy, that was a gas, that was. Now I take a look at what we got, like Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity. You got to be kidding me. And so this idea of intellectual stimulation, where? In fact, I was to the point, I got so exasperating reading the news, I was looking for a William F. Buckley YouTube of a debate, and I found one 1965 in London when he debated James Baldwin. Wow, what a debate that was. Hour and a half. And yeah, I mean, those are 2 intellectuals sitting with a moderator between them and just verbally going at it in a polite fashion, each respecting the other. And then they shook hands before they started. They shook hands after they were done and walked off together, small talk, and that was the end of it. How many times you see that on television anymore? You got to be kidding. And so, yeah, and so going back to what you're talking about, Ellsberg, but then again, add free press and censorship to this. And if you've ever read, I urge you to read some of the Pentagon papers. That's a fascinating read because that comes from where? Your government. Yes, it was. And yeah, did some of the newspapers print it regardless? Yes. Yes, they did. And interestingly enough, talking about the courts, Julian Assange was another one who stated that some of what they printed, they asked the Defense Department first, and then put it up. So, interesting here again. Who controls the message? Interesting who controls the message. But outright censorship, like you saw in 1798 and 1917-18, and then apparently what you're seeing developing today, that's cause for concern. That's truly cause for concern. Which is why, you have to support editors like that. Gerald, well, he's not at the Hour anymore. Of course, the Hour got bought out by the Hearst organization. And he's no longer there. But, and these editors don't really have the name. Maybe you knew about them locally, but are they national? No. Who were committed to First Amendment rights of free speech, writing, so on and so forth. And you got to give these people credit. You really do. You really do. And so sometimes, like in my position, you start writing certain things. To hell with it. Send it. They don't like it. Too bad. Sometimes it's like throwing something up against the wall, see if it sticks. In that instance, it stuck. So, and like I said, there were many black people. Okay. Okay. Yeah. It was about 5-6 years ago. Of this, right. 5-6 years. I have to go check my records and dig that missive out again. I think it was about 5-6 years ago. But if you want our children to have a window into that era, why sanitize it? Why sanitize it? No. I mean, that's why when I go to these book fairs, I'm not going to go to Barnes and Noble and do this. I go to these book fairs. I look for stuff like that because now it's older, and I get like my wife found Black Sambo. Yeah, years ago when I was selling cars to offset my writing income years ago, one of the salesmen was black, and he says, "Hey, Mark," he says, I have a, well, it was a CD, it was a tape, when they had the old movies, you slip into the, yeah. And he gave it to me. I said, "What's this?" Amos and Andy. He says, "This stuff's funny." I said, "Thanks." And he gave it to me. Yeah. So sometimes this stuff about black, white, that's politically inflamed too to a certain extent. So, I mean, I know some black people who have a great sense of humor. The word nigger? Oh, okay. Well, all right, you used it, but it's in the right context. Okay, that's fine. No, I was at some of those rallies, after when those youngsters, the high school students, against automatic weapons, and that can be inspiring to see, and so they're beginning to take their place politically. And did they get some criticism? Yeah. But, when they're 15, 16, 17, that criticism is one thing. When they get to be 18, 19, 20, the criticism will become more pronounced. They're not kids anymore. And my wife and I were talking to a few of them. I said, I think what you're doing is terrific because a lot of your grown-ups have failed you. I said, but at the same time, understand something here. If you get something done, and I hope you do, if you get something done, it's not over. Then you have to move on to the next agenda. How about student loan debt? And don't think that those people that are cracked down against them don't understand that one. Armistice Day, right? See, over here, that might not be such a big deal. But in Europe, oh yeah, that's going to be huge. Here, yeah. Another aspect, too, going back to controlling information, you go back to the First World War, and you find that who won that propaganda war? The British or the Germans? The British did. Well, guess who controlled the cables, communication cables, going from Europe to the United States? The British. Interesting little side note. So their message is going to be their message is going to get out, and the Germans won't be getting their message out as much. So, again, controlling information, controlling the agenda, and which is why, again, going back to Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. There were some that, the Nixon administration wanted him strung up by his Buster Browns. And it's not going to happen. I mean, that's, number one, it's an undeclared war. And so if there's an undeclared war, somebody's hiding something here. Instead of going before Congress and asking for that declaration from the people's elected officials, which is what your founders really wanted. Do your presidents do that anymore? No. Does it lead to other forms of shenanigans like trying to control opinion? Yeah, of course it does. Remember, again, controlling opinion or controlling people's perceptions, it amounts to the same thing in the end. Did George Bush want all those coffins coming back from Iraq photographed? President Obama did. Of course, we only got 1, 2, or 3 coming back. What's the big deal here, right? Not when you got 20, 30, or 40 coming back. Now, we can't photograph that. And where does that come from? Vietnam. Yeah. I remember, you probably remember too, on the Daily News and Daily Mirror during the Vietnam War, they had the box, the body count in Vietnam. And, yeah. And you're thinking, it's that numbers, and you're thinking, they got to be running out of men soon. Well, were those numbers really correct? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you really, going back to what I mentioned before about George Bush Jr. not wanting the coffins photographed, and yet you go back to FDR. Again, this is a declared war. It's a world war. The sides are carefully delineated here. And the invasion of Tarawa. The Marines, November 20, 1943. And they landed at Tarawa on the Gilbert Islands. A little 1-mile island. 1 mile, pork chop shaped. And in 3 days, it cost the Marines 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded. The Japanese, it was over 4,000 Imperial. This is Marines against Marines. I'll tell you where that's going. And out of over 4,000 defenders, the Marines only took 17 prisoners. And I remember seeing these film clips taken by Marine combat, photographers, because they sent some of these guys in with the Marines, Marine photographers, and you see these dead Marines. Their bodies are already stiff, floating in the surf off the beach, and they wanted to suppress that. You know what Roosevelt said? No, it gets shown in the movie theaters. Well, who's the commander-in-chief here? And it was shown. And Roosevelt did that to show the American public this is not going to be a cakewalk. This is war. And it helped to galvanize the people because, we got to get this over with. And I always remember Richard Tregaskis. I don't know how many people remember. He was a war correspondent. He wrote the book Guadalcanal Diary. And he went in with the Marines at Guadalcanal. He also went in the second day on Tarawa. And in an interview he did 29 years later, he lived in Hawaii, and he was quite candid about this. He said, picture yourself at the end of this, your 3-day battle, there's over 5,000 guys on an island 1 mile long, and they haven't been picked up yet. And you're 2 degrees off the equator. What did that smell like? And it's like an oppressive pall that hangs over the atoll. And Richard Tregaskis remarked, he says, I have a stench in my nostrils I haven't gotten rid of in the last 29 years. Interesting here, when you talk to people like this, what you get. And so Roosevelt urged that these photographs need, this movie footage needs to be shown in the movie theaters so the American public understands what their boys are going through. Not, we're going to suppress it. So when you see your own kind stiff as boards like this floating in the surf, let's get this over with. Interesting. Is that freedom of expression? Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. Of course, there's a political agenda there. I'll give you that. But still, he didn't censor it. You know, you're going to feed people the sugar, feed them the sulfur too. And that's exactly what Roosevelt did. You know, you got to give Roosevelt credit. That's a war leader. That's a war leader. So, interesting. I'll be back next week. And next one is the American Putsch, or the business plot. The potential coup against Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. And I will have, and I'll bring in my copy of the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, which I'll refer to. I got 113 pages of this. This is the first House of Un-American Activities Committee that investigated this. John McCormick, remember him from Massachusetts, later became Speaker of the House. And his co-chair was Samuel Dickstein, a congressman from the Empire State, who later became Chief Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. And they will investigate this. The hearings and the transcripts, the testimonies given by some of the so-called participants make a great soap opera. Some of it's riveting. And I'll get into the hero that comes out of this, who was Smedley Darlington Butler. Yeah, I know the name sounds funny, but this gentleman was a 2-time Medal of Honor earner with the Marine Corps. He is one of 19 Americans to accomplish that feat. And he's one of the more fascinating historical Americans of the first part of the 20th century. Quite the patriot here. And, you know, he's the one that, and I'll get into this, how he turns all the plotters into Congress, and that's where this starts. So that's an interesting perspective here on in 1933. So it's an interesting story, interesting saga here. Otherwise, that's it. Have yourselves a good evening, by the way. Thank you.